So the G20 summit is happening right now in Brazil, and on the sidelines of that meeting, a major bilateral between Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar and his counterpart in China, Wang. These two top diplomats have met, and they have agreed to push forward the discussions on border talks between India as well as China. Remember that on the sidelines of the BRICS meeting in Kazan in Russia that took place just a little while back, India and China had agreed to a patrolling deal that would help create disengagement on the line of actual control in the northern sector of the across the line of actual control between India and China, which would help end the border crisis that has gone on over the last 4 years between India and China. Now, of course, the two foreign ministers, S. Jaishankar, Wang, meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit and really discussing how to take that process forward. So very interesting development, but also very interestingly, we haven't seen a readout yet of the Indian side of the meeting. We've seen, of course, a tweet by Foreign Minister Jaishankar where he talks about, in a very limited sense, this is what we talked about. We talked about the border disengagement, and we also talked about some other global issues, but it's a very short statement. Whereas the Chinese have released a large readout talking about the importance of India-China relations, not allowing, respecting the fundamental interests of the two countries, the expectations of the global south, really laying out the fact that the India-China relationship is very important, talking about mutual dialogue and communication and properly handling disagreements with sincerity and good faith and restoring bilateral relations. Now, this, of course, explains there's a bit of a difference in terms of how the two countries see this problem. Remember that while the border crisis was going on over the last 4 or 5 years, India's view was that the border crisis would have to be resolved before bilateral relations could be restored to normalcy, because you might recall that political contacts were almost totally frozen between the two countries. Diplomatic contacts were also few and far between. There's very little political trust, economic restrictions on investments made. So it was a fairly frigid time for the India-China relationship. China's view was always that, look, let's not make the border the be-all and the end-all of the relationship. Let's talk about other things as well, like trade, economics, cooperation on other international forums, and India wasn't having that. So China releasing the statement talking about the importance of India-China relations, their destiny as two great civilizations, two great Asian powers, is really just a load of flowery diplomatic language. But what's trying to convey to Indians and to the world is that, look, India-China relations are important, they're significant. We should not let a border crisis derail what's happening between the two countries. But India's view has always been that, look, this is a sign of a broader problem in the relationship where China is disrespecting India's national interest. 20 soldiers from India's side were killed in the Galwan Valley clashes, and this is not something that India is just going to let go. It is something that China is going to have to commit to a new set of principles on. Remember, in the 1990s, India and China agreed to a set of border principles that maintained stability on the border for several years. China broke those principles, and now you're going to have to put things back together, and you're going to need a broader political understanding. And without that, India is like, you cannot disrespect our interests on the border and come in and block access to areas that we consider our territory, which is what the Chinese forces have been doing, and then expect everything else on the relationship to be hunky-dory. So now, you see this difference in two statements. And in fact, China has also made, China is now, of course, actively pitching for an improvement in the relationship with India. This is something you see in the Chinese statement. Your diplomatic statements tell you a lot about what countries are asking for. The Chinese have said, and the Indians did not mention this, which shows how, in some sense, the Chinese may be pushing harder for a restoration in normalcy in the relationship more broadly, which is that they want a restoration of direct flights, they want to exchange journalists, and they also want easier facilitation of visas. So China is pushing hard for normalcy and a normalization of the relationship with India after 4 years. India is treading cautiously, but the fact that there is so much disparity between the two statements is at least interesting. But the two sides have met, and it does seem that the two countries are interested in pushing things forward, cooperating more, and restoring some stability, some normalcy to the India-China relationship. Will it go back to the optimism that it used to be seen with at some point at some points in the past in our history? No, perhaps not. But at least there seems to be some limping back to normalcy in the India-China relationship. So that's one big thing coming out of the G20 summit. But of course, the main star of the show is Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's there, who has spoken at the G20 summit, which is also going on today, by the way. And he has had a series of very important bilaterals. He, of course, had a quick pull aside, had a quick chat or greeted President Joe Biden of the United States. So that's, of course, a conversation. But he's also had like some very detailed bilaterals with key leaders from around the world, of course, with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, of course, defeated Rishi Sunak to win election as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And now the Prime Minister is, of course, meeting Keir Starmer. They've talked about the India-UK comprehensive strategic partnership and the importance of relations between the two countries. But two things stand out. The first one, which may be of interest to Indians more generally, is that that Prime Minister Modi asked for address the importance of addressing the issue of economic offenders from India going to the UK, which is, of course, referring to people like Vijay Mallya, the liquor baron in India, who, of course, is an economic offender here, is now living in the UK. India has asked for the extradition of people, these fugitive businessmen to be extradited and brought back to India. So that is a key thing that he has raised with Keir Starmer. Also, the India-UK Free Trade Agreement is a key economic agreement that will be that both sides have agreed to sort of push again, see where there can be accommodation, because during Rishi Sunak's tenure as Prime Minister, although of course he was of Indian origin and there's a lot of enthusiasm for him here in India, the simple fact of the matter was that his conservative government was unable to push for a consensus on immigration, migration, easier mobility rules for Indian professionals to come and work in the UK for projects and so on and so forth. And that was a big sticking point in the negotiations. Of course, the UK also wanted things. It also wanted easier market access. That was not in particular sectors, and in particular sectors, those conversations did not move forward. But now both countries are saying, look, we want to get a better deal on this. We want to get this done. And so now the two sides will hopefully pick up the ball and move on this. So that is another big meeting. Of course, meeting with the President Emmanuel Macron of France, talking about the relationship in space, defense, energy, and so on and so forth. Also talking about Prime Minister Modi also congratulating President Macron on the successful hosting of the Paris Olympics in 2024. Of course, those of you who may have been following the news know that India may be making a bid for the Olympics as well. So this is, I think, not a chance mention in this statement from Prime Minister Modi. I think that, of course, this does indicate that India may also make a bid for getting the Olympics. Of course, also meetings with the Prime Minister of Norway, where India's Arctic policy was discussed. That is also something, along with clean energy, that India has been working on with Norway, but also with a bunch of very, very prominent Norwegian and Scandinavian countries. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, of course, of Italy as well. That relationship was also taken off. India and Italy also released a vision statement over the next action plan for the next 4 or 5 years until 2029. If my memory serves me correctly, it's just been released by the Ministry of External Affairs, talking about where to take cooperation in terms of economics, in terms of people-to-people linkages, in terms of defense. So on the Ministry of External Affairs website, you can catch it, but it's really about over the next 4 years, how is the relationship going to evolve. So another interesting meeting. And also, of course, meetings with Portugal and the leader of Indonesia, Prabowo Subianto, the new president of Indonesia. Again, a very, very important relationship. Indonesia has come up, of course, its economy is growing. It is becoming increasingly important in the electrical vehicles game. Remember that nickel, Indonesia is the largest producer of the world's nickel, which will be very crucial to the energy transition towards electric vehicles and so on and so forth. Some interest from Indian companies in going to Indonesia, building infrastructure, cooperating on renewable energy. Remember, it's a country of over 200 million people, one of the most significant countries in the Islamic world, but also in Southeast Asia. That is a relationship that India has wanted to develop for some time. It hasn't grown as much as we would like it to, but absolutely it is going to be something that is going to be important to India's foreign policy. We also have an interview with an Indonesian expert, Jose Rizal Damuri, which is on the channel. You can absolutely find it. It is on the India-Indonesia relationship and what the two countries need to do to focus on each other a lot more. And of course, with Portugal, Portugal is an interesting country. We don't discuss it too much, but it is a country that helped open up Europe to the European Union, to India. Remember that the 2021 meeting between Prime Minister Modi and the European heads of state happened in Portugal, and that was not a coincidence. It's a relationship that has done well, and Portugal has been a close supporter of better India-EU relations. So that was also an interesting meeting. Of course, we'll keep you updated on the Prime Minister's ongoing visits and engagement. But of course, just to close out, the Prime Minister also spoke at the session on the fight against hunger and poverty. And he talked about India's record on working on hunger and poverty and providing rations to 800 million people, as well as providing affordable healthcare, boosting financial self-reliance, using technology for development, and so on and so forth. So Prime Minister making his intervention there. Again, like I said in the past, why we talk about the Global South and why the Global South is on the agenda. Of course, India has talked about the Global South a lot in the past, but the important thing that I would like to impress upon you, our viewers, is that over the last couple of years, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, the many developing countries have had a really, really difficult time economically. Their levels of indebtedness have increased. Their social development indicators have actually worsened instead of getting better across a range of things, across nutrition, across their ability to provide proper healthcare. The COVID-19 pandemic, as well as a number of shocks like the Ukraine war, like the war in the Middle East, has been absolutely damaging and devastating both economically and socially for a number of developing nations. They crucially need money, they need recapitalization, they need support, financial aid, so they need their debt to be forgiven or restructured in some way that allows their countries to recover. They need economic support, they need help in terms of providing more support for climate change, because these are many countries, particularly in Africa, for example, that will be the worst affected by climate change and are the least equipped to take on the side effects of what would happen with climate change. So it is a serious problem. I can recall I once did an interview with the one of the most senior UN officials, which was Achim Steiner, who was, of course, part of the UN development hierarchy, and of course the chief of the UN Development Authority. And he spoke very passionately about the problems that Global South countries are having right now after the COVID-19 pandemic. Really a lot of concerns about the financial viability, the political instability in a lot of these countries. So rising debt levels have been a huge problem. I think in 2010, developing countries had around $1.5 trillion in debt. Now it's doubled to over $3 trillion. So massive rise in indebtedness, which they are unable to meet. There are about 19 developing countries that spend more on debt than they do on education, that is servicing their debt and paying off their loans, that they do on education, which is a massive problem. Like I said, massive rollback in their SDGs, massive climate change exposure as well. And India, that's why it's been pushing so hard for the Global South. That's why the Prime Minister is going to be speaking at a lot of these events and making the Global South really the focus of India's G20 presidency last year, but also really continuing that focus this year and supporting the Brazilians and later the South Africans, who are going to be taking over the G20 next year, in terms of their efforts to push for the interests of Global South countries. We will keep our eye absolutely on this story, and we will keep you updated on what's happening in the G20 summit in Brazil. Of course, after that, Prime Minister Modi heads off to Guyana, which is another extremely important relationship and will be the subject of our weekly show Threadbare, which will be out today. So please do catch it at 7 p.m. if you would like to know more about the India-Guyana relationship. Thank you so much for watching this live with us here on India Today Global. We will keep you abreast of all the developments from the G20 summit and the Prime Minister Modi's engagements there. Thank you so much.